You are listening to the One Day at a Time podcast. On this podcast, my guests share their stories of alcoholism, addiction, and how they recovered so that you can too. My hope is that you find the inspiration and resources you need to let go of what's holding you back so that you can transform into the person you were always meant to be. Ready? Here we go. Hey friend, welcome to the podcast. In case you're new here, my name is Arlena and I'll be your host. We're doing something a little bit different today, which is to look at addiction through the lens of the family. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to family members of someone struggling with drugs and alcohol who just want to know how to help and who are feeling scared and angry and confused. I mean, shoot, I've been there myself. It's a really tough spot to be in. So today I'm speaking with Dr. Carrie Wilkens about the outdated messaging that is currently being circulated. What actually hurts, what helps, and what to do instead. We are going to review solutions provided in her book, Beyond Addiction, How Science and Kindness Help People Change, and the accompanying workbook with the tagline, Evidence-Based Skills to Help a Loved One Make Positive Change. I really love this. There's so much messaging around you can't help other people or you can't control or change them, but I 100% believe that you can influence people with your presence. So to give you a little insight as to what to expect, I'm actually going to read an excerpt from her blog about the myth of rock bottom. And I quote, "First, it promotes a belief that the change process cannot start until bottom is reached. It also implies that people won't change unless they are punished enough by their own behavior that they see the light. Both of these assumptions could not be further from the truth, and they have contributed to many treatment providers sending patients away and telling them to, quote, come back when you're ready." I think that's a horrible thing. It also contributes to family members and friends feeling like their only option is to step aside and watch their loved ones suffer. Many opportunities for change in lives have been lost due to this flawed belief, culturally loaded statement. End quote. So that is so good. I'm going to leave a link in the show notes at odatchat.com for the full article, but that is just a little bit of an insight into our conversation today. I also do have one quick announcement. There is a new resource guide available on my website called How to Quit Drinking, 30 Tips for Your First 30 Days. It has very practical strategies for getting started, how to avoid cravings, and what to do when you get a craving, and a simple mindset hack to help you get through your day. You can download it for free at soberlifeschool.com, and if you get it, let me know what you think. I know this is going to be a great episode, so if you find it helpful or know somebody who will, please feel free to share it. So that's it for the intro. Please enjoy this episode with Carrie and let me know what you think. Dr. Carrie, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm super excited. I have, for those of you who are not watching YouTube, I'm holding up your book, which is kind of hard to read with all the lights, but it's the Beyond Addiction Workbook for Family and Friends, Evidence-Based Skills to Help a Loved One Make Positive Change. And this is the essential guide to the invitation to change approach. So we're going to spend the majority of our time talking about this because I found this I love a workbook because there's something about a workbook that allows me to sort of slow down my thinking and kind of break down concepts and to just really digest important information. And so that's why I love a workbook. But it's always nice to hear a little bit about your personal story, like what led you to, I feel like anybody in this space is kind of heart-led. We're on a mission, right? We're on a mission to alleviate unnecessary suffering and facilitate healing and stuff. So, how did addiction or this type of work, touch your life personally?
In a whole host of ways, as you might imagine. It's funny, the power of the unconscious, right? Where it takes us. I grew up in the middle of nowhere in Western Kansas, in a really small rural farm community, and there were no resources for mental health or anything, and had a few family members who, I know what it is now. I didn't as a young person, realizing like, oh, you actually have real PTSD and you're drinking because you're in the middle of nowhere with PTSD, and that's the only way that you can manage how you're feeling, right? So I know what that was now. I didn't as a kid, and I didn't know growing up. And it was a rural community. We all overdrank. We binge drinking. I was drinking and driving. Like I met criteria for everything. When I was 17, 18-year-old. And then went to New York City and decided to pursue psychology, because there's also nobody talks about psychology in the middle of nowhere in Western Kansas, or at least they didn't 50 years ago. And so I studied psychology and went to graduate school, and I had no interest in going into addiction. Didn't think that's what I was going to do. And one of my last, so when you're a graduate student, you're working with clients and you're getting supervision. And I worked with this woman for probably a year. She was one of my last training clients. And in my last session with her, she had been coming, she was late to session. She was extremely traumatized. She had a very difficult family situation. And the last session, she told me she was drinking 2 bottles of wine a day. So she was in alcohol withdrawal the whole time I was working with her. And I had never been trained in graduate school to ask about substance use. I hadn't, in supervision, it had never been come up to be curious about it. And I was like, oh, okay, so that's never going to happen to me again. I was so upset that happened, that I sought out additional training in my internship and postdoc, and then fell in love with it, because psychology, and so this was, almost 30 years and 25 years ago now, psychology was not a part of addiction treatment programs. Psychology and psychiatry were very separate from the chemical dependency programs, which you're laughing because you think, oh, how did that even be possible? Right.
No, this is a story that I've heard over and over again, and it never ceases to drive me crazy how little the medical professionals are trained in addiction. Makes me crazy.
Yeah. Well, and the so back then it was called chemical dependency programs, right? So the counselors in those programs, for the most part, they were in 12-step recovery. They were in recovery themselves. They were trained to help people stop using substances, and abstinence was really kind of the only goal that was an acceptable goal. And then, so you had those programs, and then you had the psychiatry and mental health programs. And so you would be in that program, and they would not accept people with substance use problems. So if you had a substance use problem, you couldn't go to the group for depression or, the social support group, because you needed to go deal with your addiction problem. Meanwhile, the people in the addiction program couldn't really help you with the depression or the trauma or all the other things that you were dealing with. So the systems were very bifurcated. And as a young psychologist, I was like, this makes no sense. I don't actually... How does this function? I mean, we could do a whole podcast on the history of why that all came to be, but
right.
That was the reality. And, I'm somebody who tends to do things when I get mad at something that exists, and so I want to fix it. So my partner, Jeff Foote, and I decided to start the Center for Motivation and Change, because we really wanted to prove that you could create a system, that treated substance use problems, but that you would be providing a very high level of mental health support. So everybody is a social worker, a psychologist who can deal with all of the underlying co-occurring issues, and they're trained to help you deal with the substance use piece. And we wanted to prove that you could treat people at a whole range of motivation and levels of severity. So we've, previously addiction programs would, if you didn't want to be abstinent, they'd be like, come back when you're ready. Like if you don't want to be abstinent, we can't really help you.
Yeah.
That's another thing I say about CMC. We grew because we would take all the rejections from these other treatment programs. If you would call one of these other programs and say, I really want to stop cocaine, I really want to stop drinking, but I'm not sure about pot. I don't have problems with it, right? The other programs would say, yeah, when you want to stop everything, you can come. And until then, you can go to CMC. So we just started working with people who were like, had all sorts of range of goals. And we've got services where if you want to abstain and that's your goal, we've got groups and programming for that. And if you're more ambivalent and aren't sure and want to take a more harm reduction approach, we've got programs for that, so.
I think that's so important because everyone's like, I think the old way of thinking, like you were saying, it's either abstinence or nothing. But, I come from a sales background. And so the number one rule in sales is like meet people where they're at.
But that was not true in addiction treatment until very recently. So, which is just really.
I feel like hearts and minds are starting to change. And, but there's always this, I might be jumping ahead, so reel me back in, but, there's always this thought of, do I need to get sober first and then do the trauma work, or do the trauma work? That's what's going to lead to recovery. Because I've been in recovery a long time, and I've seen people who cannot stay sober. And I'm like, that person has that person has a trauma issue. That person has PTSD, and the PTSD and the trauma need to be addressed before they can maintain like long periods of sobriety. That's my thinking. I'm not a doctor. What do you think?
No, that's proven in the research.
So which one comes first, though? Do you have to be sober in order for the trauma therapy to work, or do you do it at the same time? What are your thoughts on that?
No, a lot of the more recent research is that doing it concurrently is what's helpful. Different. I mean, the reality is like you line up 10 people who have PTSD and a substance use problem, and some of them are going to be able to do both right out of the gates. Some of them are going to need to stabilize around their substance use because it's just too on fire and they can't even show up for the trauma therapy. Some of them need a different set of skills before they can tolerate the trauma therapy. So you really have to individualized treatment, which is another thing that hasn't been done so well when it comes to dealing with substance use problems, is like genuine individualized treatment. Like, what does this person that's sitting in front of me need, and what does their family need? Because every single person's different. And that's really not how most programs are designed to operate. People kind of go through a cookie cutter course of treatment. And it's a disservice that we do.
You even start off the book with, one size does not fit all. I mean, because I've heard like for some people that the trauma therapy actually triggers using again.
Yeah.
And so it's you're right. It's absolutely on an individual basis. I think we need to have skilled facilitators and therapists and stuff who really understand all the tools that are available and assess people sort of where they're at to know when to plug in certain tools.
Yeah. And, it's an example I use a fair amount. I worked with this young woman who, when she started seeing me, she was probably like 22 years old, and she had been probably to 6 different rehabs before starting with me. And 6. Yeah. And had a very serious opioid problem. And the first time I sat with her, I was like, oh my God, you've got the worst PTSD. I mean, she'd, been sexually assaulted as a really, really young person multiple times. So she had been suffering with PTSD, and she'd gone through all of these programs where, the message was you need to go to 12-step meetings as part of the recovery process. She wanted to do treatment. She wanted to be sober. She wanted all of these things. She would go into those meetings. And so as a young woman with very active PTSD, she'd go into if you think about what a 12-step meeting is, it's a room full of strangers, right? That you don't know you don't know everybody who's in that room. Right. Fair number of them are men. So she would go and get completely flooded, and she couldn't tolerate the meetings. And she would be constantly getting the message from the traditional treatment providers that you must not really want to be sober because you're not really engaging in 12-step. That was the message she got multiple times, and she literally couldn't tolerate it.
She didn't go to women's meetings?
She tried that too, but like she did, it was like her trauma was multifaceted.
So she was one of those. She was one of those who needed trauma therapy.
Yes, before she could. Yeah, and we did that. And now she's an active member. She goes to meetings all the time, but she just couldn't tolerate it. So that's just an example of like she had been trying to do it the way that people had been laying it out for her.
And the message she got was that she didn't want it enough.
Yeah.
She wasn't willing. She didn't surrender. That makes me crazy. That's really cruel.
But said by well-intended people, like those people.
These
are
people who are not trauma informed.
No, and they're not intending to do harm, and they think they're they're doing what was done to them and the messages they got, right? So there's nothing,
Yeah.
and they're trying to help her, and they're trying to help her find her way
Yeah. They're
with
not
the way that they
professionals.
know, right? And it just wasn't what that girl needed. And so that
Yeah.
was an example of the trauma actually really did need to be treated before she could take
Got it.
advantage of other things.
Yeah, I mean, as much as I'm a huge 12-step advocate, but there are some guidelines. I'm writing a whole book about it, but there's some guidelines that need to be established, I think,
Yeah.
for a lot of people before they go through that process. And that is a clear case where the trauma need. Yeah, 12 steps are not trauma informed, and these are people that are they're not professionals. Right. This is like information handed down from one person. This is what worked for me. If you are like me, then this could work for you, type of thing. But
Which I'll go on record saying it's unbelievably powerful. I mean, that community is so strong and is actually heals an enormous amount of trauma, because people find their community within those rooms, which is incredibly powerful. But, we just, again, I think the message just needs to be, you got to really slow down and think about what the person right in front of you needs, because it's going to be different than the person next to them. And we just, and that's a lot of work. And people like things in sound bites, and people like quick fixes, and people like to be able to say something like, oh, you're not ready yet. Like that's easy to say. But when you really slow down and unpack it with each person that you're trying to help, that's an enormous amount of work and a long, slow journey for many people. And that's what I think we don't like to really wrestle with. We like things to be quicker than that.
Listen, who doesn't like a quick fix?
Right. Well, and it's understandable because people who are using substances are often doing really dangerous things, right? You really want them to stop doing what they're doing because it's scary, and they might harm themselves or harm somebody else. So the urgency of we need to get you out of trouble makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, and I do want to talk about like the from the family's perspective, like this conversation. I really want it to be through the lens of, how can a family member participate? Because I was always taught that this is a family dynamic. The people at home oftentimes can be the factor whether you make it or break it, so to speak. And I think it's so important and I've been on both sides of this now. So I was sober, I've been sober for a long time, but then when I had a child that struggled, and even though I knew all the things for me, I did not know how to handle for my son. And it was a very confusing. I was like, as much as I know, why is this so hard? But it was very hard because of all the things you mentioned. There's a real threat of this being a life or death issue, like with the drugs that are out now. I didn't know that drugs could be delivered to your house. They were finding drugs through Snapchat and social media. And I didn't even know that was a thing. I was like, my kid's home all the time. They're safe. They're home all the time. I didn't know that they were picking up drugs from at the, local mailbox. Anyway, it was a whole thing. Yeah. And we were terrified. It was the most terrifying experience I've ever been through. And so I wish I would have had this book before, but let's just start at the very beginning with, part one is helping with understanding, and you start off with behaviors make sense. Can you explain a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, sure. Can I back up a little bit?
Sure. Yeah.
Further, just in terms of how the invitation to change approach came to be, because it's important, because we just didn't make it up, right? We took
evidence-based.
Yes, it is evidence-based. So one of the other things that we did after we opened the Center for Motivation and Change is we got trained in something called CRAFT, which is Community Reinforcement and Family Training, which is a really effective protocol for family members that, again, nobody heard about, right? Like no treatment providers didn't know about it. The treatment industry wasn't talking about it. Nothing. We would go give these lectures on CRAFT and, just how effective it was. And I'd say, who in the audience knows anything about CRAFT? And it would be crickets, like literally not a hand raised.
I hadn't.
Right. And, the studies go back, like 25 years now, like wow, even longer. And, it wins the horse race every single time. When they look at the, in the studies, they would take family members who had a treatment resistant loved one. So they had somebody they cared about who didn't want to be in treatment and didn't want to change. So they would take those family members and assign them to one of three conditions. They'd assign them to learning how to do an intervention, right? Because that's what we do with people who have substance use problems.
There's a whole show around it.
Right. They'd assign them to go to Al-Anon and work with a therapist from an Al-Anon approach, or they'd put them with a craft therapist. And, in all the studies, and this was across like different ages, different severity of substance use, different demographic groups. The outcomes were pretty much the same across the board, which is the people in the Al-Anon condition would get like 3% of their loved ones into treatment, which there's nothing surprising about that, because Al-Anon isn't designed to get your loved one into treatment, right? Like that's not what it's. In fact, they often say you really can't have like that kind of influence on your loved one, right? But it's a lovely support group for family members, and it's one of the things that's most recommended, but it doesn't get people into treatment, right? Interventions, got people into treatment like 30-40% of the time. And, but interventionists will say, I get people into treatment 100% of the time. And as a treatment provider, I know what happens on the other side of that. Sure, you get people into treatment, but they're pissed. They're mad about it, and they're mad at their families, which is not a great way to start treatment, right?
Yeah.
Craft gets people into treatment like 60 to 75% of the time. So that's a big, significant number. And then what they also found is that the person with the problem, by the time they went to treatment, their substance use was already less before they even entered treatment, and the well-being of the family member was improved. So it had all these benefits. And again, nobody was talking about it. So we wrote the book Beyond Addiction, How Science and Kindness Help People Change. And that was based on craft and really trying to help family members have a roadmap based on craft. Because we really were like, we got to get the word out.
Yeah.
Had some success at that. And we started training family members to support other family members in craft, because there's also never going to be enough treatment providers in the world. And also a lot of family members, for cultural and access reasons, they're never going to go to formal treatment, right? But they may talk to the mom down the street. They may talk to their faith-based leader. They may talk to, an educator. They may talk to somebody in their community, but they're not ever going to go talk to see a therapist, right? So we were trying to figure out, how do we get these evidence-based ideas into the hands of lay people so that they can share this information with each other? Because that's really how we change the world, is get lay people to talk about this in a different way. So we started to try to train people in craft and to help them teach other people craft. And what we realized, which was really striking, is so craft is all based on positive reinforcement, right? Behavior changes because you're reinforcing positive things and you're setting limits around some of the more negative things. And what we realized was very hard to teach family members some of the craft skills, because they had all of the language of kind of how we think about, the cultural language of how we think about addiction, which is, you got to use tough love. People have to bottom out in order to change. You can't do anything to change. You got to distance yourself. They had all these messaging, that people say all the time. I mean, the number of times people have said, yeah, somebody told me my son can't change until he bottoms out. Like, I hope we can eradicate that phrase. So we realized that we've got to literally kind of unbrainwash people, essentially. We have to really challenge some of that cultural languaging for them to then be motivated to pick up the craft skills. So the Invitation to Change approach has all of craft. It has all the craft skills. We added a lot more in the communication section for motivational interviewing, which is a very effective set of strategies that help lower defensiveness, increase internal motivation to change. And then we added this whole helping with understanding section, which is the one where you ask me about in terms of one size doesn't fit all, behaviors make sense, and ambivalence is normal, because we really wanted to give family members this idea of how you think about the problem is everything, right? Because if you think about it through a moralistic, my loved one's just a bad drug addict using drugs, or my kids,
if they loved me, they would change.
They would change. My kids just being rebellious. Yeah, my kids just being rebellious, or whatever. If you look at it through that lens, you're going to approach it with a certain set of strategies, right? And you're going to communicate about it in a particular way, usually with anger. or frustration, right?
Maybe.
Right. If we can shift how you
Fear.
understand fear, which often translates into anger first,
For
right?
sure. Oh, yeah.
So we
Mine
really
did.
wanted to take this understanding section to help people understand it through a different perspective.
Okay.
And whenever we do these trainings, I'm always so struck because I think, of course, this is like everybody knows this. And meanwhile, we do these trainings with family members and they're like, I've never thought about my loved one through this lens. And I feel completely different about them now that I see it this way. The core approach being behaviors make sense, which is as human beings, we don't do things unless they work for us in some reason. Like there's some
Get a
benefit.
payoff.
Right. There, like you don't keep putting your hand on a hot stove. You might do that once and then you were like, oh, that's really painful. I'm not going to do that anymore. If somebody's going back to something, it means they're getting something from it. And substances can be very powerful reinforcers, right? So they have all sorts of effects we like. They reduce anxiety, they help people sleep, they take the edge off, they pick people up, stimulants, like they pick people up, they help people reduce pain. I mean, I can go on, like the list goes on and on and on in terms of like why I might gravitate to a substance, right? Because it's giving me something that I don't otherwise know how to give myself or don't have in my environment, right?
Right. Yeah.
And just going back to the trauma, if I'm having nightmares, if I'm keyed up and I'm hypervigilant all the time, drinking, taking pills, all of that can just lower my nervous system, right? Like I can't do it on my own because I'm walking around with PTSD, but if I take substances, I feel calmer in the moment. Granted, your listeners are going to be saying, oh, but it's all short-term gain, right? It's all short-term. And what about all those negative consequences? Yes, there are always negative consequences with serious substance use, but you can't erase those initial benefits, right? And if you can actually understand the benefits of somebody's substance use, that's where we go in and we can say, okay, this is what they're getting from it. So what else can I reinforce in the environment so they can learn to get it in a different way? Our relationship can potentially provide some of those benefits. I can reinforce things that, so if my kid is smoking pot because he's really socially anxious and doesn't know how to make friends, in any other way, how can I take a very focused, intentional effort to help my kid be in sober environments so he can make friends in a sober way, or can I get him some help with his social anxiety? Like, can I help him deal with that in a different way? Can I, all the different skills, so the benefits of the substance use, it gives you the roadmap of how do I help, right? So that's the first. And it also increases empathy of like, oh, this person isn't just being a bad person. They're doing something that they're getting something from.
Yeah, I would have to, I just want to interject here that, from my own personal experience, as somebody who was using is that's how I survived.
Right.
Those early 14, like I had childhood trauma. I didn't know I had trauma. I thought my life was normal. And so I was walking around with trauma and I didn't know it. But my whole thing, like my theme song was like from Pink Floyd, the Comfortably Numb. I just needed relief from what I was feeling. And that's what I was seeking. And it wasn't always just looking for a good time. It was, I needed relief from these terrible feelings I was having. And my parents didn't understand that. I was in trouble. Like I felt like a bad person.
Yeah. Yeah. And the number of times I've done an evaluation with somebody who walks in the door with a substance use and I say, ooh, you realize you have a lot of trauma. And just like you, like they didn't know they didn't know that's what it was, or that what they were feeling wasn't normal. Or they knew it wasn't normal, but they didn't know that there was something they could do about it. Right.
And my parents didn't know either. They didn't know.
Right. No, and some families have layers of intergenerational trauma. So if you have a parent who's also got trauma, they're not and has never dealt with it because, previous generations, I mean, we're only now starting to better understand it, so if your parents are in their 70s, 60s, 50s, like they didn't know anything about that at all. So, and intergenerational trauma gets passed down in all sorts of different ways. Anxiety, like a family system. If somebody struggles with an anxiety disorder, if you have a parent who's got an anxiety disorder and the world's a scary place, you're going to learn different things than a parent if you've got a parent who's got a different approach to life. So we all share these things back and forth, right? So behaviors make sense. The ambivalence is normal. Part of this is like really trying to help family members realize, like, if you're going to ask your loved one to give something up, right? You're asking them to give something up that's working for them. And there's all this other stuff that they're going to have to learn to replace that thing, right? So that thing is doing something for them. If you're going to ask them to give it up, there's a gap. and they don't know how to deal with it, so that like you, like, I don't know how to deal with my feelings. It's going to take you a while to learn how to deal with your feelings, right? Like
But it took so long.
it's
I was like, when I first got sober, I was like this giant raw nerve ending,
right.
and I was like so sensitive, like everything hurt. And,
Right.
oh.
How long did it take you?
Well, I got lucky in the sense that I found a 12-step community that was really supportive, and I was young and there was like a big young people's group. And
Mhm.
so, but I don't remember, it's been a long time. I got sober in 94, but it took a while. I would say in some cases, I'm still learning some emotion management because it's like,
Yes.
we're always growing and evolving, and
Yes.
trauma is deep work, resetting that default mode network through years
Yeah.
of meditation, prayers. I mean, I do all the things, but it took a long time for me to stabilize. I would say probably that good first, 90 days before I was even sort of like awake
Mm.
enough to absorb some things. Like my brain was still healing from all that
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah. And so that learning process of like, okay, I'm going to give up this substance that's doing something for me, or behavior, like whether it's gambling or eating, like this, all this stuff applies to different
It's
behaviors
all
too,
this.
right?
Yeah.
It's a lot of overlap. So if I'm going to give that up, I've got to fill that. I've got to cope with whatever that was in a completely different way. And I
Yeah.
don't know what's going to work. I'm going to have to practice at it. I'm going to have to
Yeah.
try different things, so there's a lot of learning that needs to happen in that space. And part of what happens when family members, like, so if their loved one's trying to change their substance use and they're successful for a while and then they go back to the old behavior, a lot of family members will feel like, oh, they weren't serious. Oh, they don't really want it. Oh, they just want to
There's
keep using.
there's no
You
other explanation. It's like I know that they're searching for explanations for why.
right. But
Like
so, but
why? Yeah, they don't get it. Yeah, they don't really get it.
Well, but I think that's part of, so the ambivalence is normal is to actually be like, okay, my loved one shifted, right? Their motivation shifted. They went back to that old behavior. What is it in the environment that contributed to that? Is there something I can do about that? Is how I approach that. If I get mad at that ambivalence, if I go to lecture that ambivalence, if I say things to them like, oh, you didn't really want to change in the first place, all the things that come out when you get mad and scared, that actually makes ambivalence worse, right? So
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but can
yeah.
we define a little bit of what ambivalence means? Because like when I'm thinking about relapse, in the sense, the traditional sense of relapse, like you go back to using or whatever, it wasn't that I was ambivalent about it. It was like there was a trigger and I had like no other impulse control. And then I just felt shitty about it and kind of defensive. And do you know what I mean? It wasn't that
Right.
I didn't. Ambivalence makes me think of like I don't care if I'm sober or not. Is that what you're referring to?
I think family members often feel that that's the case. Family members.
Oh, they're
So,
perceiving behavior
yes,
as like I don't care. Got it.
yes,
Okay,
yeah.
that's
So,
yeah.
like when
Okay.
the person with the problem goes back to that old behavior, family members can feel like, oh, they're not really serious. They don't really want it. They
Uh,
never want it to change. Versus actually being able to
oh,
see it through the lens you just described, which is I got triggered and I didn't know how to deal with it. So I went
yeah,
back to this old behavior that works really well for me. So if your family member
yeah,
approaches that moment in time with anger, derision, judgment, all this
yeah.
kind of stuff, again, it's going to make you feel defensive. It's going to make you feel misunderstood. It's going to make you
Totally.
want to hang on to the old
Yeah,
behavior more because you
absolutely.
have to justify it. Versus if your family member is like, hey, what happened? Like, is everything okay? What's going on? Like,
Mm.
what's going on for you? You seemed like you were making a lot of steps forward and you had a setback. Do you know what contribute? So just how you talk about it can
Oh
keep,
yeah.
because part of what we're trying to help family members do is keep the conversation going. Like the more you're talking, the more you're
Right.
connecting, the more ways there are to help and be supportive, right? If conversations are shut down and there's nothing but anger and fear activated all the time, like
Yeah.
everybody's a little boxed in, right? So
Yeah, that anger and fear is so powerful.
yeah, yeah,
And so the whole ambivalence is normal as a way to suggest having empathy. They
yeah,
say Brene Brown was like famous for saying that empathy is the antidote to shame. And when she said like hit me
yeah,
like a ton of bricks.
yeah, yeah.
The empathy is the key here.
Yeah. And we do, and it's not the fault of families. I mean, it's really our culture. We shame people with substance use problems. I mean,
Oh
it's
yeah.
like there's so much shame and stigma. Nobody wants to have a substance use problem. I've never met anybody who struggles who's like, yes, I'm having a great time, right? Like It's like, I'm in hell. I don't know how to change. I'm
Yeah.
scared of changing. I'm completely
Hell.
overwhelmed. So
Yeah.
having family members understand that is part of what we're trying to do here so that they can approach their loved one in a different way. And then that one size doesn't fit all. Family members get very locked into, they have to be in treatment, they have to do this, they have to do that. And they get told that too, right? If your loved one's not going to meetings, they must not be really wanting to, they just get all this stuff. And to be able to be like, hey, you know what,
Yeah.
we're going to like really step back and think about like, what is going on for my loved one? And what can I potentially put in front of them that might be helpful to their change process?
The biggest takeaway from this whole workbook was the updating all the old ideas. Like
Yeah.
there is so much misinformation. It's
Yeah.
just outdated. It's just
Yeah.
outdated. And I love that we have the science and the evidence to show. And it makes sense too when you go through it. It's like when you describe, I could see it from both sides as a user and as a parent, that when you come at it with fear that turns, like I was totally that parent that turned into anger. I was so, I was afraid. And like my sadness and anger, or my sadness turns into
Right.
as much
Yeah.
work as I've done. I was all jacked up.
Yeah.
So I that was like the big takeaway from this book. It's like, oh, it's the approach is empathy and compassion for myself as a
For yourself.
parent.
Yes.
Yeah, this was all like me management.
Well, but that's the perfect segue to this next section, which is the helping with
Awesome.
self-awareness section, which is really all that, right? Is being able to check
Yeah.
in with yourself and be like, okay, because everybody wants to start with the helping with action section, which is where like, family members, when they're like, tell me what to do, tell me what to say. And it's like, I would love to do that, but you got to get in your body first, right?
Let's
And
get right first.
just understand where you're coming from. Because a lot of the
Oh man.
communication strategies, if you're a big, gigantic raw nerve, if you're furious, if you're terrified, it's very hard to use some of these communication strategies. So yes, the communication strategies are incredibly helpful. If you're emotionally dysregulated, it's not going to come out like you want, like it's going to be all like, ugh. So we really try to get family members to pause and check in with themselves and check in with what they need. And so part of that is understanding your values, like what kind of parent do you want to be? What kind of partner do you want to be? Like really letting yourself be that. And again, we did that because there is this really strong cultural messaging of you got to distance yourself, you got to use tough love, like all these things, right? That make family members feel like they're doing something wrong if they're engaging, like you're an enabler. Like how many times, like if you engage, you get told you're an enabler. Like these phrases
Sometimes that's true though.
Right, but that phrase gets tossed around a lot,
Too
and
much.
family members end up feeling like if I do anything, I'm enabling, right? Versus like I can give my child attention, I can give them positive attention. I can reward my child or my loved one for engaging in a bunch of positive behaviors that I want to reinforce, right? So that's not enabling, but people get so scared of being enablers that they just are like, I can't do anything. I'm completely frozen. Which again goes like
do you find that it's like one or the other? They're either super controlling or they're super like hands off. There's not a lot of middle ground because nobody understands how to segregate,
how to be strategic and intentional.
like there's the moderate, like tools that work for the moderate user will not work for the really severe user. I don't think it's like you said, it's not a one size fits all. Like there may be a time when I'm like, I can't be around. I can't be around you. It's making me crazy. Like I need a break or whatever.
No, and the helping with that self-awareness section, by checking in with yourself, our goal is to help you know where those lines in the sand are for you.
Got it. Okay.
So you being able to say like, okay, I got to have this conversation. I really need to say X, Y, and Z to my loved one.
Yeah.
And I haven't slept in 2 days. I've been crying. I probably shouldn't have this conversation tonight. And I definitely shouldn't have a conversation when they're intoxicated. Right.
Oh my gosh. Can I tell you the number of times I've gotten phone calls from people and I'm like, why are you talking to them? They're not going to even remember this. And you're all crazy around it. And the other thing, I feel like such resistance around them, like I don't know what else to call them, but like the Al-Anon, those people, the family members that are suffering, they're like, let me be clear, they're the problem. It's not me. I'm like, you need to get help too. And they're like, I'm not the problem. They are.
Yeah. Which again is when you're completely burned out and when you're mad and when you're hurt, that's an understandable place to get, right? That's a
Yeah, for
very
sure.
self-protective place to get to, which is like, it's not me. They're causing so much damage. They
Yeah.
have to, right? So,
I
I
don't need
mean,
help. They do.
right. Which again, just, I mean, I have compassion for how we all
Mhm.
get to these little places that we get to, right?
Yeah, for
But part of
sure.
what the invitation to change is trying to do is create a lot more psychological flexibility for the helper and for the person with the problem. Is being able to be like,
Flexibility.
yeah, it's being able to be like, okay, like I have my values, I have the things that I want to do, I have the things I would like to happen in my household. What are the strategies, the communication strategies, and the reinforcement strategies that I can do that I can control, right? So yeah, you
Mhm.
mentioned like our desire to control other people, like we end up trying to do a bunch of stuff to them, right? Versus
Mhm.
like being able to be like, okay, what can I do? What am I bringing to the table? How am I communicating? How am I setting up things in my house? What am I reinforcing? What am I setting limits around? And being able to be really reflective and intentional about that. And part of that self-awareness section is about trying to help people get themselves settled enough so that they can be very strategic. Because the thing about these communication strategies and these reinforcement strategies is they require some strategy, right? You can't
Yeah.
just be like, I'm
Yeah.
going to have this conversation right now because it's really important that like my loved one hear X, Y, and Z. Well, yes, that might be a really important conversation to have or a really important limit to set. When you set it, how you communicate, the tone you take, all of that is going
Oh,
to have a huge impact on the level of defensiveness that you're going to get in return. And what we're trying to do is lower that defensiveness, like, and I say to people all the time, like how I communicate with you, I can make you defensive in 1 second, or I can communicate in a way that gets you wanting to talk to me. I'd rather have you talking to me because then I can help.
yeah.
I can help, I can
Yeah.
do stuff, we can brainstorm together, we can collaborate, we can work together. If I just make you defensive right out of the gate because I start telling you what to do, I tell you my opinions, I say it to you in a tone that's like not so great, you're going to not listen to me. And you're going to actually hang on to your side of the battle
Yeah.
a little more
Yeah.
tightly. So we're just trying to lower defensiveness.
I mean, that's pushing, and pushing automatically provokes resistance,
Yeah.
which is the last thing we want to do, is create resistance.
Well, and the other thing that family members do, and this is a bind that parents get into all the time, is they make themselves the negative consequence, right? So if I'm mad enough at you, right?
Oh, right. Yeah.
If I lecture you enough and I tell you how much I'm feeling, and if I tell you how much I'm hurt, you're hurting me. If I'm the consequence that's meaningful, maybe you'll change, right? Like I
Mhm.
don't want the family member to be the consequence, right? I want to get you out of the way, and I want to help you make the world like so your loved one is starting to experience the naturally occurring consequences that are associated with their behavior so that they start to realize my behavior doesn't work. Like if I want my job, I actually can't stay up all night. I have to get up out of bed and I have to show up for work on time, right? If my parent is dragging me out of bed every morning and getting me to work, I've got my job just fine. My mom's being a nightmare and I'm mad at my mom because my mom's so difficult, right? So,
Right.
right. But the mom is trying to get me up to go to work. What we
Mhm.
try to help family members do is like actually get out of the way of some of those negative consequences. And you can't let all of them play out, because some people are like drinking and driving or they might lose their job and they're the sole provider. There might be things that you actually can't let happen.
Situational. Yeah.
Yeah, but I had a woman that I worked with whose husband was falling asleep in his chair every night. He'd sit there and drink beers, and he'd kind of pass out in his chair, and he'd have beer cans all over the place. Kids were like, I think they were like 12 and 10. Kids would be in bed, and he'd lay down and basically pass out because he was drinking. And she would be furious. They'd fight every morning, right? Because she would get him up out of his chair. She'd clean up everything around him because she didn't want the kids to see it. What we
Mhm.
did was actually start to leave him in his chair. So when the kids came down in the morning, they saw their dad passed out with beer cans all over around him, which was embarrassing to him. And he didn't want his kids to see him that way. So it stopped the behavior because he didn't want his kids to see him that way. When his wife was cleaning it all up and dragging him to bed, she'd be mad at him the next day. And he'd be like, you're being such a
Yeah, we
nag,
know what he said.
right, right. But so that was just an example of how
Yeah.
she kind of was trying to use her anger at him as a way to motivate him, and it wasn't working.
Right. It wasn't
The
working.
kids, him being embarrassed in front of his kids, huge motivator.
Does that damage the kids? Are we worried about how
At 10 and 12, like them fighting, them yelling,
that's worse. Yeah,
it was worse, and it like literally the kids had to see it a couple of times, and he course corrected pretty quickly because he was like, I didn't, she knew that when we were thinking through the consequences, she knew he cared about being a dad a lot. And he cared about his kids, what his kids thought about him. So that's one of the reasons why we intentionally let that play out a little bit, was because she knew that would really actually impact him. So again, that's just an example
situational,
of like being strategic. That might not have worked so well in another family, or with different age kids or whatever.
Right.
So that
makes sense. I see
two parts of the invitation to change approach are then what set you up for figuring out the communication and what kind of reinforcement and consequences you want to kind of have in the mix. And again, that's where everybody wants to start, but it's usually not the best place to start.
I know, because I was looking at this and I was looking at the clock and I was like, so tell people what to do.
I know.
But okay. So we're setting the foundation. So it's, having this whole new emotional level of understanding, like with compassion and empathy, and ways to help with awareness. I do want to get to the action part, because I know everyone's listening to the, like you said, everyone's going to want to get to the action part, and there's a lot to this. And let's just say that there's community support, and there's, so we'll, I'm going to leave links to all the things in the show notes. So we'll get to that.
Yeah,
but what else do we need to know before we hit the action part?
Don't skip over the self-compassion part. So the
self-compassion.
That's a big one. So Kraft had self-care as part of what family members needed to do, right, to help regulate themselves. But in the last decade or so, Kristen Neff and Chris Germer, like there's a whole bunch of researchers and psychologists who've been doing all this like really interesting work on self-compassion, which is not self-care. Like self-compassion is actually like really doing the internal work of figuring out how to be kind to yourself and treat yourself like you often treat others, right? Like sometimes we're much better friends to our friends than we are to ourselves. And parents in particular, because substance use problems are so stigmatized, people with the problem and their families feel horrible. They feel horrible about themselves, family members, families, parents in particular. They're blamed for the problem. They're blamed as part of the problem. They're blamed for not doing something about the problem. So they just walk around with all of this shame. The self-compassion piece of this is very important to like really target that shame, because that's what causes people to isolate. That's what causes people to not talk about it. Like if I go to a dinner party and people find out what I do, I come home and my husband's always like, all right, so like how many people like acknowledge that they know somebody, right? Because people just start talking about it. Like everybody knows somebody.
Everybody knows somebody,
but they don't talk about it. We just don't share that information. And when you do, you realize like, the person down the street has a loved one. That mom I thought was so cool. Her kid also struggled, So what we're trying to do is also help people connect with each other and support each other and realize like helping is hard, helping's scary and hard. And you're like, when you're helping somebody with a substance use problem, that work can be incredibly painful. So we need support. You need to have compassion for yourself for when you like you may be like, okay, I'm going to have this great communication with my loved one. Right. And then I end up losing my temper and yelling at them, I use myself. I use myself as an example with my sister all the time, because I'm like, I do this all day long and my sister struggles with cigarette smoking. And I'm like, I'm really good with her. Like,
oh, God damn it.
3 out of 4 conversations. And then the 4th conversation, I just get mad and I yell at her, like, it's just like, I'm like, oh God, because I get upset. So being able to have compassion for those moments when you just are not your own best version of yourself,
it is hard to watch somebody love suffer. It is hard. It causes me pain. Yeah.
Yeah. So we want to bring compassion to that. And then we're spending so little time on the action part because all this other stuff I think is actually the most important in some ways. But the action part is helping loved ones really identify those naturally occurring consequences that they can let the world be their teacher, right? So like figuring out those. Figuring out what you want to reinforce, so what are the things that you want to support, that take your loved one further away from their substance use, Are there things that you can support financially? Are there things that you can support just with your attention? Being able to like just say, hey, I really noticed you stayed in that conversation with me a little bit longer and I really appreciated it, or you know what, we talked about something I know that's really hard for you and you didn't get so defensive and I really appreciate it, right? Like confident compliments go a long way to like establish that connection, or yes, you came home stoned, but you came home on time. So I appreciate that you came home on time. And I really want you to keep working on not coming home stoned, but I really appreciate that you came home on time. Right. So especially when a kid is struggling, like you get focused on everything that they're doing that's wrong. Being able to kind of just reinforce with compliments, attention, anything. Because also going back to the reinforcement of substances, we're competing with chemicals. Right. Yeah. So your loved one got chemicals in their brain that feel a particular way. So if you're going to ask them to give that up, that your relationship can't be a bunch of negative stuff. Otherwise they're going to be like, why would I want to spend any space here? Like I've just, whether I'm using or not, my mom's mad at me. Right. So if mom is setting limits when I'm using and she's engaged with me and we're doing cool stuff when I'm sober, I start to realize like, oh, being sober is not so bad. That's actually a nice thing. Mom
it's not just
waffles.
It's not just the chemicals too. We're dealing with trauma. Like the devil is inside.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's not just something that makes you feel good and the chemicals that are a sure thing, but it's the unmanageable feelings.
No, and that's one of the things that a lot of so we have a bunch of, which I can share with you at the end. There's a lot of invitation to change support groups forming across the country. Yeah. And what we hear a lot in those are just, so much of this is about figuring out how to communicate, right? The communication skills is a big part. It's called helping with words. The problem is for a lot of people, like when you start to have like really in-depth conversations with your loved one who is struggling, those conversations can be really hard. They can be really painful. You can hear stuff that you don't want to hear. You can like just come in contact with stuff that you don't feel equipped to deal with. So helping family members also just appreciate that can be part of it. And how are they taking care of themselves and how are they understanding all of this? That's just another important, just because you're having good communication doesn't mean all that communication is going to be warm and fuzzy and good. It's going to be tough. And so, and that means it's working, right? Because we want people talking, we want people connected, and we want people talking because that's where change happens. It may take a while, and it may take multiple efforts, and the road's not going to
guaranteed multiple efforts.
Yeah. But we want to help you stay on for that whole journey, and step away when you need to protect yourself. Take a break when you need to take a break. This isn't about just throwing yourself in and sacrificing everything and helping your loved one and being a doormat, right? We want to actually strengthen you and help you be more intentional and careful with yourself and strategic about how you're approaching this problem. Because most people approach it full of emotion, right? It's just leading with emotion, which those emotions are valid and important. And they're not usually the best to lead with if you're actually trying to get somebody to change.
I heard this, I was doing some educational stuff around boundaries, and I heard this term doormat to dictator, right?
That's the two extremes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the two extremes. And there's a whole range of in the middle. Yeah. And I just needed language. I needed the actual words. I needed someone to say, hey, soften your tone and try saying this, or maybe even set the stage for this whole thing by saying, we had conversations around, what, I do want to help and I don't know what I'm doing and I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to lose my shit every once in a while and just know that I'm going to do my best to, check myself, and I love the self-compassion and the self-care. The self-care practices for me were like getting grounded first thing in the morning and, reading something to feed my brain, connecting with other, so both the self-compassion and the self-care were so critical along with the language.
Well, and you keep teeing me up perfectly with the last part of the invitation to change is practice, practice, practice. And, so that little thing that you just said there of like, I'm going to try really hard and sometimes I'm not going to do it exactly right. And then I'm going to get up the next day and I'm going to try to do it again. Being able to like give yourself the grace to know that you're trying to learn a bunch of new stuff here. your family may never have communicated in this way, right? So if you're, or you may grew up in an environment where the communication was in a certain way, and now you're trying to do it differently. Those are really hard habits to break. And it just takes repetition and takes coming back to it and tweaking it and, finding your way with it. And again, going back to where we started, people kind of want quick fixes and they get frustrated when stuff takes a long time and takes a lot of practice. And we really want to try to help people approach this from a learning perspective. Like anybody who's been sober for a really long time, like yourself, like you learned how to do that over a period of time.
Yeah.
Right. It's not something you just decided to do one day. You practiced it every day. And so that's part of what we wanted to help people realize is the learning and the practice component of this, both for the person with the substance use problem and for the family that's trying to support them, as we just all need some grace so that we can practice the skills we want.
We need so much grace. Yeah. This stuff is really hard. Even,
it is.
I mean, we raised our kids in a household where we said, we love you. I'm sorry. We had conversations and it still happened.
Yeah, of course.
It still happened.
Because it turns out you're human, right?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't really all about me, as it turns out. I thought it was. I realized I played a part, but it wasn't. I did like that. What did give me comfort is I didn't cause it. I couldn't control it. I couldn't cure it. Mm-hmm. But I don't think I'm powerless. Like I know there's, our energy, it totally affects the people around us. Like I've gone to a concert where the room was electric and was lifted up by it. And then I've also been, walk into a room where you could cut the tension with a knife.
Yeah.
It's like you can feel that stuff, right? Our energy, we do have influence. We're not like completely powerless over others. Like our presence, the way we address, we do have influence for sure.
Well, and that's one of the kind of hallmarks ways of thinking about the invitation to change is we're trying to help family members create the environment where change can happen. You cannot force change, but you can manage and have an influence on the environment. And you're part of the environment, right? How you show up in the environment is a big part of this. So just so your listeners have it, the invitation to change. So we're trying to train lay people to start invitation to change groups in their communities. So we've got a bunch of fired up parents, typically. There's a bunch of fired up moms who've started groups, and they can all be found on our website, cmcffc.org. There's a resources page, and in the resources, there's groups, and you can see the groups and who's running them and where they are. And there's all sorts of resources. And then we just started a podcast for family members called Rock Bottom, Rethinking Rock Bottom. And it's 6 episodes where we interview a family member who has learned the invitation to change approach and how that impacted how they helped their loved one. And it's a really nice kind of narrative example of like where I started and where I ended up. So you can kind of hear some of these things that we talked about today, like literally in action, which might be nice for some of your listeners.
Oh my gosh, there's nothing better than a use case. I've heard the acronym for hope is hearing other people's experiences, right?
Yeah, that's really nice. And I hadn't heard that. That's sweet.
Isn't that good?
Yeah.
So 6 episodes, are you going to continue? Is this going to be like an ongoing thing or is it just the 6?
I hope so. As our little nonprofit, I got to raise some money to do everything that we do. Listen, but yes, I know.
It's nonprofit. I didn't realize that. Okay.
Yeah. Because we really want to try to, and family members can get trained. We do workshops at the website. You can sign up for the newsletter, which gives you access to upcoming workshops. We do kind of extended workshops on the invitation to change, where you can go for 2 days and be with other families and learn about it. We do lunch and learns. We're trying to make it just approachable, so people can come at it in multiple different ways. And the newsletter will alert you to different ways to learn things.
That's awesome. Well, I'm going to, in case you're driving and you couldn't write down the website or the podcast name, I'll have all of this in the show notes. And wow, I think we did really good. We
covered a lot of ground.
We covered a lot of ground. Yeah.
I really appreciate what you're doing and your podcast and who you're
this
trying
is
to
amazing.
Reach.
Yeah. No, this is so helpful because truth of the matter is like if you suffer from substance use disorder or anything like that, somebody else who is too. Yeah. Right.
No, and like you said earlier, I really wish parents would pick up this workbook before their kid starts to, I think it can be prophylactic, like if parents, because so many parents, like their kids start to use substances or engage in behaviors and they have the understandable response of like, ooh, I hope they grow out of that. Or, like just have all sorts of wishing it goes away, right? Versus like having a whole set of strategies where right out of the gates you can talk about it. Right out of the gates you can reinforce different things. Right out of the gates you can understand it and understand your kid through a different lens. So I really hope people pick up this information before there's a problem. But again, it really is helpful at the early stages all the way to, very late stage substance use.
I feel like parents have so much on their plate, like with worrying about social media and just, there's
so complex, complex.
There is so much. So if you have a 10-year-old, if you have a child, read this before they're 10, because it starts early now.
I think going back to that self-compassion, I mean, for parents, it's intense. I mean, all the things you have to keep track of with the social media, everything that can happen in their bedroom, which you don't even know. Like,
I have no idea.
Yeah. And the substances that they could be using in their bedroom that you can't smell. It used to be that you could smoke pot and you would know, right? Like, you would know. Now you don't know. You don't know.
It's so funny because I was a big pot smoker, but the smell was I had like the stoner survival kit, which was like the eye drops and mints and all that stuff. But now they have vape pens and they have wax. It doesn't even have an odor. It's crazy.
Tinctures and gummies and all sorts of stuff. Like there's just so many ways to ingest these substances that it's hard for parents to keep track of. So
brutal.
Lots of compassion for every parent out there.
Lots of compassion and lots of resources. So thank you for spending this time with me.
Yeah,
thank you for this is a really good workbook. And so you're doing great work and I'm happy to be a part of getting the word out there.
Thanks so much.
Have a great day.
Thanks.
One last thing before you go, you can follow the podcast on Instagram for daily inspiration at ODAT Podcast. And if you'd like to get a biweekly email from me with recommendations to books I'm reading, meditations I love, or other recovery podcasts, just sign up for it at odatchat.com. That's ODAAT chat.com. And if you do, I hope you enjoy it.